I never thought my father, the man who raised me after my mother's death, could look at me that way. But on the night of my 18th birthday, everything changed. His compliments lingered, his touch felt different, and the words he spoke carried a weight I wasn't prepared for. As the evening unfolded, I realized this was no ordinary birthday. It was the beginning of something I couldn't escape. Samantha had always been her father Ethan's entire world. After losing her mother at the tender age of 5, the two became inseparable. Ethan, just 23 years old at the time, had to grow up quickly, balancing the weight of grief and the responsibility of raising his daughter alone. He worked tirelessly, sacrificing his own desires to provide Samantha with a life filled with love and stability. For years, their bond was unbreakable, built on shared moments of laughter and resilience. Ethan was the kind of father who never missed a bedtime story, who stayed up late to help with school projects, and who always found time to make Samantha feel special. He was her rock, her protector, and her biggest cheerleader. Now, at 17, Samantha stood on the cusp of adulthood, her 18th birthday only days away. She was a bright, ambitious young woman with dreams of going to college and carving out a life of her own. But as she approached this milestone, she couldn't help but feel a strange tension in the air. Ethan seemed more attentive than usual, his gestures of affection carrying an intensity she couldn't quite place. She often caught him watching her with a look that was hard to decipher, a mix of pride, nostalgia, and something else she couldn't name. His compliments had shifted, no longer just the casual remarks of a doting father, but words that lingered, leaving her feeling both flattered and unsettled. On the morning of her 18th birthday, Samantha woke to the smell of pancakes and fresh coffee wafting through the house. She smiled, already knowing her father was making the day special for her, just as he always had. But when she walked into the kitchen, the sight before her gave her pause. Ethan had set the table with care, a bouquet of crimson roses, polished silverware, and 2 plates arranged perfectly. He stood by the stove, his sleeves rolled up, his expression one of quiet pride. "Happy birthday, sweetheart," he said, his voice warm but carrying an edge of emotion that made Samantha's chest tighten. It was a day she had looked forward to for years, but as it unfolded, she couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to change. As the day wore on, Samantha couldn't help but notice the subtle shifts in her father's demeanor. Ethan had always been attentive, but now his actions seemed more deliberate, almost calculated. The way his gaze lingered when she walked into the room, the gentle touches that seemed to last a moment too long, it all left her feeling unsettled. That evening, as Samantha prepared for the dinner Ethan had planned, she couldn't ignore the weight of his earlier gestures. The way he had presented her with the red dress, his voice filled with emotion as he told her, "You deserve something beautiful." It was a sentiment she appreciated, but there was a depth to his words that made her heart race in ways she didn't fully understand. When she stepped into the living room wearing the dress, Ethan's reaction stopped her in her tracks. His expression softened, his eyes scanning her with a mix of pride and something she couldn't quite name. "You look stunning," he said, his voice quiet but firm. Samantha felt a flush rise to her cheeks, unsure how to respond. As they drove to the restaurant, the atmosphere in the car was heavy with unspoken words. Ethan glanced at her often, his compliments peppered throughout the conversation. "You remind me so much of your mother," he said at one point, his voice tinged with nostalgia. Samantha smiled, but inside, she felt a knot tightening in her stomach. It wasn't the first time he had said something like that, but tonight, the words carried a weight that made her feel uneasy. The restaurant was elegant, the soft glow of candlelight casting shadows on the walls. Ethan had reserved a table by the window, overlooking the city lights. Samantha couldn't help but feel like they were on display, the intimacy of the setting making her shift uncomfortably in her chair. Ethan, however, seemed completely at ease, his attention focused solely on her. Throughout the meal, his compliments continued. "You have a way of lighting up the room," he said, his eyes never leaving hers. "Just like your mother did." Samantha thanked him, but her voice wavered. She could feel the tension building, the lines between father and daughter blurring in ways she didn't want to acknowledge. At one point, Ethan reached across the table, his hand brushing against hers as he passed the bread. The contact was brief but electric, sending a shiver down her spine. She pulled her hand away quickly, pretending to adjust her napkin, but the moment lingered in her mind. On the drive home, the silence between them was deafening. Samantha stared out the window, her thoughts racing. She wanted to believe she was overthinking things, that her father's actions were nothing more than the well-meaning gestures of a loving parent. But deep down, she knew something had changed. When they arrived home, Ethan hesitated before unlocking the door. He turned to her, his expression unreadable. "Tonight was special," he said softly. "Thank you for letting me celebrate with you." Samantha nodded, forcing a smile. "It was a wonderful birthday," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. But as she stepped inside, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was unraveling. The warmth of her father's affection, once a source of comfort, now felt overwhelming, almost suffocating. She replayed the moments in her mind, the lingering looks, the tender gestures, the way his voice softened when he spoke to her. It all felt too much, too intimate. That night, as she lay in bed, Samantha couldn't sleep. Her thoughts spiraled, each memory of the day blending into a haze of confusion and doubt. She wanted to dismiss it all as a product of her imagination, but the intensity of her father's attention was impossible to ignore. For the first time, Samantha felt as though she was standing on the edge of something she couldn't control. And as much as she wanted to turn back, she wasn't sure if it was already too late. The morning after her birthday, Samantha woke up feeling restless, the memories of the previous evening swirling in her mind. She tried to shake off the unease as she got ready for the day, but the strange energy that lingered between her and Ethan was hard to ignore. She told herself it was nothing, just her imagination running wild, but deep down she knew better. As she walked into the kitchen, she found Ethan already there, his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee. He looked up and smiled, his eyes softening as they met hers. "Morning, birthday girl," he said, his voice warm. Samantha hesitated, then forced a smile. "Morning, Dad." Ethan's gaze lingered on her for a moment before he stood, gesturing for her to sit. "I made you some tea," he said, sliding a cup toward her. Samantha nodded, feeling the tension in the air as she sat across from him. The silence between them was heavy, broken only by the clink of the spoon against her cup. Samantha avoided his gaze, focusing on the steam rising from her tea. But Ethan didn't seem to notice her discomfort. Instead, he leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table as he studied her. "You look different today," he said suddenly, his voice thoughtful. "More grown-up." Samantha's cheeks flushed, and she looked away. "Thanks," she muttered, unsure of how to respond. But Ethan wasn't finished. "I mean it," he continued. "You're not just my little girl anymore. You're beautiful." The word hung in the air, heavy and loaded. Samantha's stomach twisted as she met his gaze, searching for some sign that she was misinterpreting his words. But his expression was earnest, his eyes filled with something she couldn't quite name. Thank you," she said finally, her voice trembling. She stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. "I should get dressed." Before Ethan could respond, she hurried out of the room, her heart pounding in her chest. In the safety of her bedroom, Samantha leaned against the door, trying to steady her breathing. Her father's words echoed in her mind, making her feel both flattered and deeply unsettled. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Samantha avoided Ethan as much as she could, but the tension between them was impossible to escape. Every time their paths crossed, she felt his eyes on her, his attention unwavering. She told herself she was imagining things, but the way he lingered near her, the way his words seemed heavier than usual, it all felt too real. That evening, as Samantha sat in the living room reading, Ethan joined her. He settled into the chair across from her, his presence filling the space in a way that made her pulse quicken. "You've been quiet today," he said after a moment, his voice low. Samantha shrugged, keeping her eyes on her book. "Just tired, I guess." Ethan didn't respond right away. When she finally glanced up, she found him watching her with an intensity that made her stomach flip. "You know you can talk to me about anything," he said softly. "I know," she replied, her voice barely audible. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "You've grown into such an incredible young woman, Samantha. I don't think I tell you that enough." Her breath hitched at his words, and she looked away, pretending to adjust the blanket draped over her legs. "Thanks, Dad," she said, forcing a small smile. Ethan hesitated, then stood, crossing the room to sit beside her on the couch. Samantha's heart raced as he reached out, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. His touch was gentle, lingering just a moment too long. "I'm proud of you," he said quietly. The words should have comforted her, but instead, they sent a shiver down her spine. She forced herself to meet his gaze, searching for some hint of the father she had always known. But the way he looked at her now was different, unfamiliar and unnerving. "Thanks," she said again, her voice shaky. She shifted away from him, clutching the blanket tightly. "I think I'm going to head to bed." Ethan nodded, his expression unreadable. "Good night, sweetheart," he said, his voice soft. As Samantha retreated to her room, her thoughts spiraled. She couldn't ignore the way his touch made her skin tingle, the way his words left her feeling exposed and vulnerable. She hated the way her body reacted, the way her heart raced whenever he was near. Lying in bed, Samantha stared at the ceiling, her mind racing. She wanted to believe that she was imagining things, that she was reading too much into her father's actions. But deep down she knew the truth. Something had shifted between them, something she couldn't explain or control. And as much as she tried to deny it, she couldn't ignore the strange, forbidden pull that seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. The days following Samantha's birthday felt like a blur, each moment overshadowed by the growing tension between her and Ethan. She tried to focus on her usual routines, schoolwork, hobbies, spending time with friends. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't escape the unease that lingered every time she was alone with her father. One evening, as Samantha sat in her room scrolling through her phone, she heard a soft knock at the door. "Come in," she called, assuming it was Ethan. She wasn't wrong. He stepped inside, holding a mug of tea in his hands. "I thought you might like something warm before bed," he said, his voice gentle. "Thanks," Samantha replied, her voice hesitant. She set her phone aside and took the mug from him, her fingers brushing against his. The brief contact sent a jolt through her, and she quickly looked away. Ethan sat down on the edge of her bed, his expression unreadable. "You've been quiet lately," he said after a moment. "Is everything okay?" Samantha hesitated, unsure how to respond. She wanted to tell him the truth, to admit that his attention was making her feel confused and vulnerable. But the words wouldn't come. "I'm fine," she said instead, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan didn't look convinced. He reached out, placing a hand on her shoulder. The touch was meant to be comforting, but it felt heavier, more deliberate. Samantha's breath hitched as she glanced up at him, her heart pounding in her chest. "You know you can talk to me about anything," he said softly, his gaze locked on hers. "I know," she replied, her voice trembling. She tried to pull away, but Ethan's grip on her shoulder tightened slightly, holding her in place. The air in the room grew thick, the silence between them charged with unspoken tension. Samantha's mind raced, her thoughts a chaotic swirl of fear, confusion, and something she couldn't name. She wanted to scream, to push him away, but her body felt frozen. Ethan's hand moved, brushing a strand of hair from her face. His touch was slow and deliberate, his fingers lingering against her skin. "You're so grown up now," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "So beautiful." The words sent a chill down Samantha's spine. She stared at him, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Dad, what are you doing?" she whispered, her voice shaking. He hesitated, his expression torn between guilt and something darker. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice thick with emotion. I can't help it." Samantha's heart raced as she scrambled to her feet, putting distance between them. "This isn't right," she said, her voice rising. "You're my father. You can't do this." Ethan stood, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. "I know," he said quickly. "I'm sorry, Samantha. I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable. But the damage was done." Samantha backed away, her chest heaving as she struggled to process what had just happened. She felt trapped, cornered in her own home, the one place that had always been her sanctuary. "I think you should leave," she said finally, her voice firm despite the tears streaming down her face. Ethan hesitated, his expression filled with regret. "Samantha, please. I didn't mean to." "Leave," she shouted, cutting him off. Her voice cracked, but her resolve didn't waver. Ethan nodded slowly, his shoulders slumping as he turned and walked out of the room. Samantha waited until she heard his footsteps fade down the hallway before collapsing onto her bed, her body racked with sobs. The next morning, Samantha avoided Ethan, staying locked in her room until she was sure he had left for work. She felt a mix of anger, sadness, and guilt, her emotions swirling in a chaotic storm. She didn't know how to face him, how to move forward from what had happened. As the days passed, Samantha found herself withdrawing from everyone around her. She avoided her friends, ignored her texts, and skipped meals, unable to shake the weight of what had happened. She felt lost, trapped in a situation she couldn't escape. Then one evening, as she was lying in bed, her phone buzzed with a text. It was from Ethan. "I'm sorry for everything. I hope you can forgive me." Samantha stared at the message, her emotions a mix of anger and sadness. She wanted to respond, to tell him how much he had hurt her, but she didn't know where to start. Instead, she deleted the message and turned off her phone. The next morning, Ethan confronted her in the kitchen. "Samantha," he said softly, his voice hesitant. "Can we talk?" She shook her head, her eyes filled with tears. "I don't know what to say to you," she admitted. You crossed a line, Dad. I don't know how to forgive that." Ethan's expression crumbled, and he looked away, his hands trembling. "I never meant to hurt you," he said. "I was confused and I made a mistake. But I love you, Samantha. You have to believe that." Samantha's chest tightened, her emotions threatening to overwhelm her. "I do believe that," she said finally. "But love isn't enough to fix this." Ethan nodded, his shoulders slumping. "I understand," he said quietly. "I'll give you space." Over the next few weeks, Ethan kept his distance, leaving Samantha to process her emotions. She began to open up to her closest friend, finding solace in their support. Slowly, she started to piece herself back together, finding strength in the knowledge that she wasn't alone. In time, Samantha and Ethan began to rebuild their relationship, but it was never the same. The trust between them had been shattered, and while they both worked to heal, the scars remained. The days following the confrontation were marked by silence in the house. Samantha avoided Ethan at every turn, and he made no attempt to bridge the growing chasm between them. The once warm and lively atmosphere of their home had turned cold and distant, each corner steeped in tension and regret. Samantha found herself grappling with a storm of emotions. Anger, sadness, confusion, they all mingled, leaving her feeling like a stranger in her own body. She couldn't understand how the man who had always been her rock, her protector, could have crossed such a line. She questioned everything, even her own memories, wondering if there had always been signs she had missed. She threw herself into school and spent more time out of the house, leaning heavily on her best friend, Lily, for support. Lily listened without judgment as Samantha finally opened up about what had happened. "It wasn't your fault," Lily reassured her, her voice firm. "You didn't do anything wrong." But Samantha couldn't shake the guilt that lingered. She replayed every interaction with her father in her mind, analyzing her words, her actions, her reactions. Could she have done something to stop this? Was there something she had missed that could have prevented it? Ethan, on the other hand, was a shadow of his former self. He stopped trying to engage with Samantha, instead retreating into his work and spending long hours away from home. When he was there, he stayed in his room or the garage, as if to avoid being a reminder of the pain he had caused. He knew he had betrayed her trust in the worst possible way, and the weight of that realization consumed him. One evening, Ethan finally broke the silence. Samantha was sitting at the dining table, staring blankly at her untouched dinner, when he hesitantly approached. "Samantha," he began, his voice trembling, "I know I can't undo what I did, but I need you to know how sorry I am." Samantha didn't look up, her fingers tracing the rim of her glass. "Sorry doesn't fix this," she said, her voice hollow. "It doesn't change what you did." Ethan nodded, his shoulders slumping. "I know," he said. "And I don't expect you to forgive me. I just want you to know that I'm trying to be better. For you." She finally looked at him, her eyes filled with tears. "I don't know if I can forgive you," she said. "And even if I do, things will never be the same." "I understand," Ethan replied, his voice barely above a whisper. He left the room, leaving Samantha alone with her thoughts. Over the next few weeks, Samantha began therapy at Lily's suggestion. Talking to someone impartial helped her start untangling the complicated web of emotions she felt. Her therapist helped her understand that the guilt she carried wasn't hers to bear, and that her father's actions were his responsibility alone. Through therapy, Samantha also began to find her own voice again. She realized that setting boundaries was not just necessary but empowering. She started standing up for herself, asserting her needs and making it clear to Ethan that she needed time and space to heal. Ethan respected her wishes, keeping his distance while continuing to work on himself. He started attending therapy sessions of his own, determined to face the deep-seated issues that had led to his actions. He knew that repairing their relationship would take time, if it was even possible, but he was committed to doing the work, even if it meant accepting that Samantha might never fully forgive him. Months passed, and while the pain remained, Samantha found herself slowly reclaiming her life. She spent more time with friends, joined a photography club at school, and even began planning for college. She realized that her future was still hers to shape, no matter how much the past had hurt her. Ethan, too, began to change. He became more involved in his therapy, learning how to navigate his emotions and rebuild himself from the ground up. He apologized to Samantha repeatedly, not expecting her forgiveness, but wanting her to know that he was trying to be a better person. One evening, Samantha came home to find Ethan sitting on the porch. He looked up as she approached, his expression tentative. "Can I talk to you?" he asked. Samantha hesitated, then nodded, sitting down beside him. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence between them heavy, but not as suffocating as before. "I know I've said this before, but I need to say it again," Ethan began. "I'm so sorry for what I did to you, Samantha. I know I broke your trust, and I don't know if I'll ever earn it back. But I'm trying. I need you to know that." Samantha looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and resolve. "I believe you're trying," she said quietly. "But it's going to take time. A lot of time." Ethan nodded, his gaze steady. "I'll wait as long as it takes." Their conversation didn't solve everything, but it was a step toward healing. For the first time in months, Samantha felt a glimmer of hope that, while their relationship would never be the same, they might find a way to move forward. Months turned into a year, and while the pain of what had happened between Samantha and Ethan lingered, time began to soften its edges. The distance between them was still there, but so was a tentative effort to rebuild. It wasn't about returning to what they once had. Both knew that was impossible. Instead, it was about finding a new normal, one rooted in honesty and the hard lessons they had learned. Samantha's therapy sessions became a cornerstone of her healing process. She discovered strength she didn't know she had, and slowly, she began to let go of the guilt she had carried for so long. "You're not responsible for someone else's choices," her therapist had told her. Those words became a mantra, a reminder that her father's actions were his alone to own. Ethan, too, was changing. His therapy helped him confront the deep grief and unresolved emotions he had buried for years. He began to understand the ways his own pain had clouded his judgment and made him vulnerable to crossing boundaries that should never have been tested. It was a painful process, but one he knew was necessary, not just for Samantha, but for himself. The first significant step toward reconciliation came on Samantha's 19th birthday. She had insisted on spending the day with friends, avoiding the intimacy of a family celebration. But that evening, when she returned home, Ethan was waiting with a small cake and a card. "I know you didn't want to celebrate with me," he said quietly. "But I wanted to let you know that I'm proud of you, and I hope this year brings you everything you deserve." Samantha hesitated before accepting the card. Inside was a simple message: "Thank you for giving me the chance to be better. I'll never stop trying." Her eyes welled with tears as she read the words. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a step. Over time, Samantha began to see her father not as the perfect protector she had once idolized, but as a flawed human man. He had made terrible mistakes, and those mistakes had left scars. But he was trying to be better, and that effort mattered. Through her own growth, Samantha realized that forgiveness didn't mean excusing what had happened. It didn't mean forgetting or pretending it hadn't hurt. Forgiveness, she learned, was about releasing herself from the weight of the past, allowing herself to move forward without being defined by what had happened. By the end of the year, their conversations became more frequent, though still careful. They spoke about her college plans, her photography hobby, and even her new friends. For the first time in a long time, Samantha felt a sense of hope. Not for returning to the past, but for creating a future where she could thrive. Ethan, too, found solace in seeing Samantha flourish. He knew their relationship would never be what it once was, but he was grateful for the chance to support her from a distance. He respected her boundaries and took pride in watching her grow into a strong, independent young woman. One afternoon, as they sat on the porch in a rare moment of shared quiet, Samantha turned to Ethan. "I've been thinking," she said, her voice steady. "I don't know if I'll ever fully forgive you, but I don't want to carry this anger with me forever. It's exhausting." Ethan nodded, his expression somber. "You don't owe me forgiveness," he said, "but I'm grateful for every moment you allow me to be part of your life." Samantha looked at him, her chest tightening with a mixture of emotions. "I don't know what the future looks like for us," she admitted, "but I know I need to focus on my own path. And I hope you'll focus on yours." "I will," Ethan promised. "I just want you to be happy." As they sat together, the silence between them felt different. Less heavy, more peaceful. It wasn't a resolution in the traditional sense, but it was enough. They were both moving forward, not together but not entirely apart either. In the end, Samantha realized that life wasn't about erasing pain, but about learning from it. She couldn't change the past, but she could shape her future. And as she stepped into that future, she carried with her the knowledge that her strength, her resilience, was her own. The scars of her experience were part of her story, but they didn't define her. What would you do if you were in Samantha's position? Could trust ever be rebuilt, or are some boundaries too far to forgive? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share for more thought-provoking and emotional stories. Stay tuned. Our next story will uncover secrets that will leave you questioning the true meaning of loyalty and love.